It's my pleasure to introduce to you Victor Davis Hanson, the Martin and Annalise Anderson Fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. Victor's extraordinary output in quality and quantity speak for themselves. Let me just give you some of the highlights. Victor is the author or editor of 23 books, including, among others, his splendid history of the Second World War that he's going to talk about tonight, Save Your Generals, Carnage and Culture, among others. Victor has written hundreds of articles, has won awards for his commentary, has won awards nationally, the Bradley Award in 2008, and he is a syndicated columnist for the National Review and newspapers across the country. I'm going to speak briefly about this book on World War II, which is extraordinary even by Victor's high standards. There are a lot of excellent books on World War II. Whit Murray and Alan Millett wrote one, Gerhard Weinberg, Richard Overy. But this is extraordinary for a variety of reasons. One, it's comprehensive. Two, it is insightfully thematic. Three, Victor makes some points that have almost been buried under the historiography. One, and I really like this one, the United States was the primary reason we won the Second World War, not Soviet Union. Two, Victor recovers, and it's often been lost, how extraordinary as a matter of proportionality Britain's effort was during the Second World War. So please welcome Victor Davis Hanson to talk about his book on the Second World War. It is extraordinary, and you're in for a treat.
I think, does the microphone work? Oh, good. I'd like to talk for about 35 minutes, just an outline on World War II, and then I want to hear what you all have to say, because everybody has a different take on World War II, and I'll try to answer as many questions as Bob thinks is appropriate. You know, if you look at conflict throughout 2,500 years of time and space, World War II stands out. It was the single largest death toll of any natural or man-made event, more than the 14th century Black Plague, more than the 20 million under the Great Famine and Terror of Stalin, maybe Mao's 60 million, but that took place over 30 years, more than the 17 million of World War I. So first thing we have to ask is, who got killed and why? And it was very rare for another reason. It was long, it was a 6-year war, but it was one of the only wars in history where more people out of uniform and civilians and non-combatants got killed than combatants. World War I, 65% of all the people died as soldiers in uniform. In World War II, 20% did. Second thing that was very strange about the war was it was one of the only wars in history where the defeated, the losers, Japan, Italy, and Germany, killed far more than the winners. Of the 60 to 65 million people who died, about 80% died on the Allied side. Think of that. Whatever we say about the losers, they were one thing, they were savage killers. And if we wanted to reduce the war down to just a sentence, if somebody asked you what was World War II about, you might say it was about German and Japanese soldiers killing Chinese and Russian civilians. So of the 60 million dead, about almost 40 million or maybe 45 million were Russians and Chinese. We forget that. And they were killed at astounding ratios. We in America are obsessed with Hiroshima or Dresden, but the German army killed about 7 times more people than it lost, and the Japanese was about 8 times more. So one of the themes of the book is I have very little pity for Japanese and German revisionism, because they started the war and then they waged it with a ferocity that it had never seen before, and it was waged entirely almost against civilians. Final thing to think about when we talk about war, why was it so lethal? And unfortunately, there was about six factors that collided in an unfortunate series of events. One, it was 6 years long, 6 years and a day, longer than World War I, longer than the Civil War, not as long, obviously, as the 30 Years' War and the 7 Years' War, but it was a long war. Second, it came at the culmination of Western technology. There had been on the design boards things like successful 30-ton aircraft carriers or assault weapons. That is, guns the individual soldier could carry, like the German GS-42, that could fire at about 600 rounds a minute. It was somewhat like an AK-47, but they hadn't produced them yet. There was a theory of incendiaries, but they were mostly aluminum and magnesium in the fruit, not jellied gasoline as the Dow Chemical Company thought they could do, and which turned out to be napalm. There were experiments with heavy water, but no indication they could build a practical bomb, no indication they could build a jet fighter. There was not an easy way of making a claymore mine. All of these developments sort of collided at once, so the war saw the replacement or the displacement of traditional bolt-action rifles, of traditional battleships. Battleship could destroy another ship at 27 miles. An aircraft carrier could bring about 10 times that amount of munitions at a range of 250 miles radius. So you can see that exponentially, the killing factors are going to be increased. When the war started in World War I, about 20% of soldiers had been mechanized. By the end of the war, about 65% were mechanized. So a World War I soldier could advance at about 25 miles at most a day. A World War II soldier, in theory, could go 55, 60, 70 miles. Gasoline was the fuel that ran World War II. And just as a precursor, I'm going to say, of all aviation gas produced in World War II, the United States produced 90% of it. And of all the oil available in the world, the three allies, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain, had access to 90% of the world's petroleum. So you're going to sort of interrupt and say, well, why the hell did the Axis go to war? So that's what we want to ask. Why would they do such a stupid thing? And war, the thing to remember about war is it's like a laboratory, a bitter, cruel laboratory. In other words, there is a reality, a platonic reality, that before a war starts, we know who's strong and who's weak. We know that if we got in a war with North Korea, we would demolish it. But what happens if that reality is not made known by the process of deterrence? Powers delude themselves into thinking that they have power that they otherwise don't. Deterrence is lost, you have a war, and then when it's all over, 65 million people are dead, people shrug and say, you know what? Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain really were a lot stronger than the three Axis powers. But it took a war because that reality had been obscured by events in the 1930s. The first, of course, was the Versailles Treaty. There's a lot of mythology about the Versailles Treaty, that it was unduly harsh or it was punitive. That's the standard orthodoxy you hear in university today. But harsh by what standard? By the standard that the Germans imposed in France in 1871? Not at all. They did not annex as much territory. By the standard of what Professor Reisling had said in 1914, remember when the German army invaded France in 1914, before it was stopped at the Marne, they had a plan to unilaterally subject France to terms in which there would have been no Belgium at all, and the entire coast of northwest France would be annexed by the Germans along with the Alsace-Lorraine permanently, along with enormous reparations in perpetuity. If it was a comparison, the Versailles, to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, remember in that treaty, Germany annexed about a third of European Russia and 50 million people. So by any contemporary treaty, the Versailles Treaty was not unduly harsh. The problem with it was humiliating to the Germans because, as you read those 400 some elements of the treaty, it presupposed that Germany, the war guilt clause, was charged with causing the war and being responsible for the destruction and death. And yet there was no permanent occupation, there was no permanent trisection of Germany. In fact, Germany surrendered, as you know, in November of 1918, 70 miles inside France. So the German homeland was never touched. And if you weren't going to occupy it, as General Foch and General Pershing wanted to do, you could see what was the mythology was going to happen very quickly. We were stabbed in the back, we were on the offensive, and then communist riots and Jews and socialists made us lose. And add to the problem, the Versailles Treaty was started, the discussions at Versailles started in January of 1919. In that 4-month period, 75% of the Allied troops had been disbanded and were gone. And it went on for 6 months, and by the end of 6 months, the Germans said, there's no occupation army, there's no army at all, they've all gone home. So let's recalibrate a little bit what we agreed to. And out of that mythology, there was this idea that Germany had not been beaten, and that Versailles had been punitive and mean and humiliating, and it was imposed on them by weaker people. Unfortunately, there were events in the 1930s that sort of superimposed that idea onto an existing falsehood. The winners of World War I vowed that they never go through anything like the 1 million-man loss at the Somme and the 1.1 million at Verdun. The losers at those battles said, we're going to do it again and do it right next time. So at the 1936 Oxford Debating Society at Oxford University, they passed a motion, we shall never again fight for king and country, the students did. Meanwhile, in Germany, people were volunteering to join the brown shirts in what would become the SS, determined to rectify the injustice they thought had been done to them. There were a series of events in Europe, the collapse of resistance to Mussolini's 1935-36 expedition to Ethiopia, which he couldn't have carried off had the British just closed the Suez Canal to him. They had 3 times the number of ships. They were afraid of causing a war. The Germans had been more successful in the Spanish Civil War. They had looked at the United States military budget, except for the Pacific Navy, and they had looked at the British budget, and it had been in decline. They looked at the cultural milieu or atmosphere in the countries of the winners, remember, and I'll just give 2 examples. In Holland, they outlawed the word destroyer for their small fleet. They thought it was too provocative. It might start another World War I. And they renamed the ship a fleet leader. In France, they outlawed all mention of the word Verdun in school books. Remember the great Pétain, they shall not pass? That was the rallying cry of the great French army. And yet, that was not allowed to be in a school book. France had, by 1940, they had better tanks. The Char B tank was better than the Mark I, II, maybe even the new Mark III. Their fighter planes were as good as the Messerschmitt 109. The great hope of the West, the indomitable French army, was larger than the German army, even though they did not have as population base as Germany did. They could have fought had they wanted. If you put the combined armies of Britain, the Low Countries, and France, that is the European anti-German alliance, they had about 3 to 2 assets in every category of war material. This is without the Soviet Union, without the United States. So why would Hitler do such a thing? Because he believed, as General von Rundstedt, General Halder said to him, they will not fight. They're not up to it. They feel guilty that they won by cheating. We're going to reverse the Versailles thing. So there was a combination of really 3 things, more specifically. There was American isolationism. People like General Pershing had tried to convince Woodrow Wilson that they needed to station troops in occupied Germany, just like we did after 1945. And you can see where we're going. 1945 peace settlement after the destruction of the Third Reich was predicated on doing exactly the opposite of what Versailles did, and it's given us 75 years of peace. American isolationism, British and French appeasement. Remember, that was a good word in the 1930s. It was a word that suggested that you like as its French and Latin roots suggested, that you like to be peaceful or pacifist and not bellicose. But the idea was, and I should say here that Neville Chamberlain was not the worst practitioner. Much worse was his conservative predecessor, Stanley Baldwin. But it was summed up by Lord Halifax when he said that if we just give Hitler what he wants, then he will stop asking for more. So you had created a situation, what I'm saying, in other words, that the weaker power, the formerly defeated power, believed that it could reverse the verdict of World War I and do so very easily because the victors did not want to fight. And one other final ingredient in this fatal triad: American isolationism, British appeasement, Russian collaboration. Hitler said, "I will never fight a two-front war like the idiots Hindenburg and Ludendorff did. I will only fight a..." This is kind of funny in that he did exactly that. But he didn't think he was going to do it at the time. And so he signed on August 23rd of 1939 the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, in which the Soviet Union, we forget this about World War II, the Soviet Union provided 30% of the fuel, food, and strategic materials of the Third Reich while it was invading France and bombing Germany later. Forget that. Remember one else thing about the Soviet Union, lest we forget. The Soviet Union made a deal, peace deal or non-aggression pact, with every single major belligerent in World War II. It made a deal with the Germans. It made, by extension, with the Italians. It made a non-aggression pact with the Japanese. And of course, it made an alliance with Britain and the United States. The irony was it broke every single agreement with us and the British, and it kept every single one with the enemies of ours, the Axis and the Japanese. So much so, I'm on a tangent, but it gets me very angry. While Americans were dying in B-29s in Okinawa and Iwo Jima, they would see Liberty ships leaving Seattle and Portland with Russian goods on them sail right through Japanese-infested waters who were killing Americans, and the Japanese would not touch them because they had a non-aggression pact predicated on the idea that the Japanese had allowed them to concentrate all their troops on their western rather than their eastern front. It was a very Orwellian situation. I think it's really important to keep that in mind when we start to read sort of Soviet revisionism of World War II. But those three factors started the war. The war was very brief. I said Second World Wars because there was 11 of them. Between September 1st, 1939 and May 1941, if you think about it, Germany had a very standard practice. They went into Poland, they went into Denmark, they went into Norway, they went into Luxembourg, they went into Belgium, they went into the Netherlands, they went into France, they went into Yugoslavia, they attacked Britain, and they went into Greece. In every single case, with the exception of Britain, and that's important, because the exception always proves the rule, they were very proximate to German centers of logistical support, of their factories, of their fuel plants. They attacked every one of those countries through surprise attack without a declaration of war. And they almost created a mythology of the unbeatable nature of what they called blitzkrieg. But you actually looked at blitzkrieg analytically and without emotion, you would say that blitzkrieg was only work with its neighbors and only work on European roads and only work within a 200-mile proximity of Germany because they did not have sophisticated tankers, they did not have adequate air support, they did not have good tanks, and yet they had conquered because of the prior ill preparation and appeasement and isolationism and Soviet collaboration. They had conquered what is now the European Union. So we fast forward to 1941 in May, and every major capital is either pro-Nazi, pro-Axis, whatever term we use, or neutral. Lisbon, Madrid, occupied Athens, fascist Rome, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Paris, Oslo, and places like Stockholm are not only volunteering to supply, these are my Swedish ancestors, supply iron ore to the Third Reich, but offering to pay the transportation cost, and as are the Portuguese with things like tungsten. So the war is over and Germany won. Remember, we're not in it. And then in the fatal year 1941, what were regional Second World Wars, and remember the word Second World War had not really appeared. If we were to look at a newspaper in 1940 to 41, we would still refer or see World War I referred to as the Great War. And these would be referred to the Polish War, the Blitz, the Battle of Britain, the Norwegian War, the Danish War. But three events in 1941 recalibrated what had been the end of this war with the victory of Germany and its ally Italy. And the first, of course, is the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, 6 months later, and most mysteriously, the declaration of war on the United States by Italy and Germany on December 11th, 1941. Those three events, and we'll look at them very briefly, explain why these world wars became one world war. I should say these regional wars became Second World War, and by the invasion of Russia, people were using the word Second World War. And the expansion of the theater now went from the Arctic Circle all the way to the Sahara Desert, and from the Chinese mainland, or even deep in the Chinese mainland, all the way to the east coast of the United States. Why did they invade the Soviet Union? They had an ally that was supplying them 30% of their strategic goods. They had won. They had some notion that the T-34 tank, and they had created 2,000 of them. Germany had about 15,000 tanks that were deployable. The Soviet Union had about 30, but 2,000 of them in every category of armament, ballistics, speed, reliability were superior to German tanks. German artillery production was about 1/4 of the Soviet Union. This is before Lend-Lease or American aid. So what was in their mind? Why would they think that? 3 or 4 reasons. Remember, what we as historians have to do, we can't, with the benefit of hindsight, go back and condemn a prior generation for their ignorance when we have all the answers, because we have history with us. So what was Hitler thinking at the time? He was thinking a lot of things. The first was that he had all of Europe and he could integrate the economy, just like the EU today. So he had the French arms works, he had the Czechs, he had natural resources, iron ore from Sweden, he had hydroelectric power in Norway, he could make aluminum, he could get tungsten, as I said, he had fuel, 10% of the world's oil from Romania. So he felt that it was no longer just Germany, but a Third Reich of 80 million people and another 200 million people. The problem was the Nazi ideology was not the European Union. And very quickly after he invaded the Soviet Union, he learned that Dutch, French, Greek food, every category of food production, manufacturing, industrial output went down. And the Germans could not do by coercion what these countries had did on their freedom of will. That was a terrible misunderstanding of the economic nature, and that you could not integrate these economies under the German model. The German model was to exploit them, kill populations, and then extract that wealth back into Germany, and often manpower as well. So that was one fundamental miscalculation. The other is he had fundamentally miscalculated Russia. He looked back at Russia and he said, Poland beat them in 1922. We divided Poland up in 1939. We made our demarcation points in 3 weeks. We took Poland. Soviet Union couldn't even do it. They almost didn't get the eastern half of Poland. And then in 1939, oops, it's always bad form. In 1939, the Finnish War broke out. The Third Reich said, this is sort of an ally. The United States was actually allied with Finland, Finland had a population of about 2 million. The Soviet Union had 240 million. It took them 6 months, and they lost 250,000 soldiers. And the Finnish army outfought them man for 6 months. When Hitler looked at this, he said, kick in the door of the Soviet Union and it will collapse. Second thing he thought is, fourth thing, he thought that Japan was a de facto ally, not a formal one yet, but the Soviet Union would never transfer 40 divisions from its eastern coast over to the west because they were worried about a Japanese invasion. And indeed, Marshal Zhukov, of all people, had fought the Japanese in 1939 and had killed 40,000 and lost 20,000. There had been a major battle there. And so Hitler was thinking, they're going to have a two-front war. Finally, and most importantly, he looked at World War I and he developed a calculus. And he said this quite explicitly in some of his letters. He said, we got 70 miles into France and you could not crack the French army. 70 miles and we lost 2 million Germans doing it. And it took 4 years and they beat us. On the Eastern Front, we destroyed the Russian army in 2.5 years, knocked them out of the war, annexed, as I said, all the way to Kiev and all the way almost to St. Petersburg. And so he had that calculus that no victory in the West, victory in the East in 2.5 years. He looked at World War II, he said the French army collapsed. If the French army collapsed in 6 weeks, from May 10th to June 22nd, 1940, just think what the calculus of World War I says the Soviet Union won. It'll collapse in 3 weeks because France is the great terror, not the Soviet Union. And what did he miscalculate? I said Soviet Union, didn't I? Soviet Union was a little different than Russia. It could bring a level of coercion that the Tsar would not even imagine. So Stalin lost 27 million soldiers, and when he ended the war, he had 700 divisions, 200 more than when he started. He didn't really care about human life, and he transferred en masse his entire industrial sector beyond the Urals. So people were starving, they had no shelter, they were living in tents, they were eating gruel, and they were making T-34 tanks and 250 millimeter guns. And the Tsars couldn't imagine a government with that ability to coerce its population. Finally, Hitler did not realize the Soviet Union and Russia had a long record of fighting very poorly outside the borders of the Soviet Union or Russia, but as his generals reminded him of the Napoleonic effort, it's a very stupid thing to invade the homeland of Russia, because Russians fight very differently when they're home versus away. There was one final wrinkle, and that is the Japanese were very, very upset at Hitler because, as I said, in August 1939 they were engaged in a terrible war with the Soviet Union along the Mongolian border, and in the middle of that war, Hitler had ordered Ribbentrop to cut this deal with Molotov, the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact, and it was a betrayal of Japan, who was fighting Russia in the field. And the Japanese said, my gosh, we had this axis of steel, we were an anti-communist alliance, and all of a sudden Hitler betrayed us, and they actually sent divisions to the east to defeat us because they had an ally in Germany, and we're going to do the same thing to them. So Hitler is preparing to invade the Soviet Union in April and May of 1941, and what happens on April 15th, 14th, the Japanese signed a non-aggression pact to pay him back, and that freed up the entire eastern front of the Soviet Union with the surety that they would not be fighting the Japanese. And remember what the Japanese thought, who were fighting. The Navy came to the Japanese and said, we haven't had a chance to show our stuff. You've been fighting in China since '31, you've been fighting the Soviet Union. We're the only branch of the services that has parity with Western powers. Our battleships, our carriers are as good or better, but they're not being used. So we want a naval war. And so Hitler had reasons, he thought, to invade the Soviet Union. He thought it would be over in 3 weeks. General Halder said at day 22, by all practical purposes, I can now write that the Soviet Union has been defeated. And indeed, they killed 6 million Russian soldiers in 2 months. They captured 5 million. They destroyed 300 divisions. They were outside, about 100 miles outside Moscow in August of 1941. They had taken Kiev. They had 2 of the largest defeats in history of warfare, 650,000 in the Kiev pocket, and they were 6 miles outside Leningrad. And the primary object of Army Group North, Leningrad, the primary object of Army Group Center, Moscow, the primary object of Army Group South, the Caspian Sea oil field, had not been attained. And at that point, Hitler realized that Blitzkrieg did not apply to a front that was 1,500 miles from Berlin and 1,700 miles long, and had enormous reserves of manpower. Germany had a population of 80 million. The Greater Third Reich, the Soviet Union, as I said, could draw on almost 240 million. And this machine, for the first time, started to wear down. And this would go on for 4 years. Now, of course, each seven Soviet soldiers were killed for each German. And of all German soldiers that were killed in World War II, the Soviet Union killed 3 out of 4 of them, which is a very stark statistic. And it burst this narrative that the Soviet Union won the war because they killed the most German soldiers. But that fated invasion of the Soviet Union, what I'm getting at, is created a world war that Germany could not win. Second event is, why in the world did Japan bomb Pearl Harbor? They bombed it for a variety of very good reasons. There was a great debate among Japan. The Navy said, you guys didn't do very well, the Army, against the Soviet Union. Now we have a non-aggression pact. You haven't done very well in China. You've been there since 31, then you came back in 37, 38, you still haven't won. But if you look at our quality of battleships, we have more battleships than does the United States Navy. In the Pacific, we have more carriers, 11-3 advantage, and they're better than the American carriers. The British will not transfer all of their carriers because of the Battle of Britain and its aftermath. And so we have parity over the United States. And more importantly, the United States did not do anything. Not only did they not do anything when we invaded China, but their staunchest ally, Great Britain, they watched it burn, 50,000 killed between August of 1940 and February of 1941 during the Blitz. And the Japanese, if you look at the minutes of Japanese discussion, it said any country that would let their closest ally burn to death and do nothing while it's surrounded won't fight. We'll hit them very hard and then they'll sue for peace. They'll do sort of what France did, a sort of Vichy attitude, and then we'll go on. There were a lot of astute Japanese that said, do not do it. And they argued, they said in World War I, this argument was made against the United States, and they had no army in 1917 when they declared war in April. In November of 1918, a year and a half later, the United States landed 2 million troops without losing one in transit into France. And by 1918, an American industry that was 50th in the world in artillery production was producing more artillery shells than France, Britain, and Germany combined. And people had warned the Navy. Remember, we all love Admiral Yamamoto. You know, I can give him hell for 6 months and I can't get... Admiral Yamamoto was the architect of this disaster. He was the one who insisted on Pearl Harbor. The Army, of all people, Tojo of all people, were sober and judicious. And they made a very compelling argument. They said, look at the Pacific. Our co-prosperity sphere goes all the way up to India, all the way up to, the Aleutians, down to India, to China, all the way off the shores of Wake Island. And all we have to do is tiptoe over 2 or 3 places. Do not touch the Philippines and do not touch Pearl Harbor. But there is no more Netherlands. They disappeared with the German invasion of 1940, and they have the Dutch East Indies. We can supply all our oil from Indonesia, what we call Indonesia today. And the Americans won't do a thing, and we wouldn't have. And they said, we can find all of our, if you want to attack somebody, attack the British in Singapore and get the rubber of Malaya. And there is no more France. Vichy France is a paper tiger. We'll just take all of Southeast Asia and the rice basket of the East. Brilliant strategy. They did take Southeast Asia. They did take Singapore, but they made a terrible mistake in attacking the Philippines and Pearl Harbor because they brought into a war a country that in 3 years had a gross domestic product that was larger than Great Britain, the Soviet Union, Italy, Japan, and Germany combined. We only had a population of about 150 million people. We fielded a military of 12.2 million people. Soviet Union was just slightly bigger, but it had almost a third larger population. There had never been a mobilization like that in the history or ever before or ever since. And yet there were people in the Japanese army that did not want to do that. But that second event of 1941 cemented that this would be an idea of a world war, a global war, that the Axis now had been very successful, could not win. And finally, Hitler and Mussolini declared war in the United States. Why did they do such a stupid thing? And they hadn't done it earlier. They did it for again, we have to go back and look at what they were thinking, stupid as it was in retrospect, but they said, the United States, we have not been able to stop their support of Britain. We almost starved them out in 1940 with a submarine campaign. We were sinking 3 out of every 5 ships that left Canadian and even American ports. Canadian ports, but we can't touch these Americans, and they're all sitting off the East Coast. If Admiral Donat said, my Fuhrer, if you'll let me go attack these ships, declare war on the United States, we'll be right off from New Jersey to Miami. They don't even have blackouts. We will wipe their entire merchant marine out. And they did almost. The second happy time, they destroyed 70% of the convoys by April of 1942 arriving. What they didn't understand that we were building a Liberty ship in the Kaiser shipyards every week, and as an experiment, we built one in one day. We were building 7,000, 10,000, and Victory and Liberty ships. We were building them 3 times faster than the Germans could sink them. The second thing they said is that the Americans have been supplying the Soviet Union, true, and they've been doing it through Japanese waters, and the British have been doing it through the Arctic Circle. We might as well go to war with them anyway because they are at war with us. And third, in a very typical Axis way of thinking, what has the United States done in the 30s? Their army is smaller than Portugal, and they have not mobilized, and they have 3,000 miles to get over here. So those 3 decisions really wrecked the Axis alliance and turned a heretofore victory into a sure defeat. A couple of things, and I'll open up for questions. One thing you do when you get yourself into a global existential war, you have to ask your question of yourselves, do I have the power to destroy the enemy's ability to make war? If we get in a war today with North Korea, we can destroy North Korea's ability to make war. They cannot destroy our ability. So they would not do it if they knew that we would reply in toto. So when this global war broke out, there were very brilliant people in the German army. And they're very stupid people, but there were some very brilliant people. And people like Guderian, and then at the field command, field marshal level, Rommel, von Rechstedt, they asked OKW or the German General Staff, how do you plan on knocking out Detroit? How do you plan on knocking out the Kaiser shipyards? How do you plan on knocking out the B-29 plants in the Middle East? How do you plan on knocking out U.S. Steel? How about Standard Oil? And Hitler said, what do you mean? He said, already we haven't even been at war. They have 6,000 4-engine bombers. They have this new B-17 they've had for 5 years. Our intelligence say they're making a B-24. The British have 4,000 Halifax and Hanley Pages. We hear they're making a new Lancaster. We have not one 4-engine bomber. Germany never made one 4-engine deployable bomber, either did Japan. The Navy came to Hitler and said, well, it's very nice about submarine warfare, but there's only 10 submarines off the East Coast, and you went to war with 50 submarines. They'd finally lose over 1,000, they would produce 2,000, but they were not able to produce submarines in great number. But most importantly, Admiral Raeder, who was a battleship commander, said, I think I've miscalculated. We have not built one aircraft carrier, and Italy has not built one aircraft carrier. And before the war even started, the United States had 7, and Britain had 7, but we've been reading about the Carl Vinson Naval Act, and in 1942, they're going to have 27 of them, each one bigger than any aircraft carrier in the world. And how are we going to get to the shores? And the discussion is very fascinating when you read these discussions. And how is Japan going to get to the shores of the United States with a carrier fleet like that and a bomber fleet? So the Axis went to war on the theory that they were morally superior, their soldiers were better trained, they'd been fighting longer, they were more professional than these cowboys in America. And Guderian said to Hitler, give me one SS division and I will wipe out all the cowboys who try to land in Normandy. Some cowboys. And the same with the Soviet Union. They're a motley group of people, they're different races, they're ready to revolt as if National Socialism had anything to offer. So when this war broke out, then the final one in December 1941, it was a race, wasn't it? Would the experienced Japanese and German and Italian soldiers didn't fight all that badly, and they had some very good munitions factories. But would this alliance of less than 200 million people, would they be able to win the war before the United States could gear up and before the Soviet Union could produce military goods across the Urals, and would Britain still survive isolated as it was? And look I'd say that the key period was September, October 1942. They almost pulled it off. If we were to look at the map of the world in 1942, from northern Norway to the sub-Sahara Desert, and as I said, from deep into China all the way to the East Coast, everything was Axis controlled. And then something happened. The Americans landed in November 1942, and 2 months earlier, Bernard Montgomery and the 8th Army stopped Rommel 65 miles from Cairo at the Battle of El Alamein. Almost at the same time, the Japanese had landed in Guadalcanal. They had cut, they thought, all routes of supply to Australia, and they did not realize the United States 6 weeks later would land. The Army Group South ran out of steam. As I said, 60 miles from the Caspian Sea, right in, almost within, they could bomb Grozny, the site of most of Russian oil production. And then on the Volga River, they got trapped in the streets of Stalingrad and would lose 1 million wounded and lost before surrendering what was left of the 6th Army. Everything turned at the limits of Axis manpower industrial capability. A couple of other observations before we ask questions. So why did the Allies win? They had greater manpower, they had greater industrial put, they had greater economic clout. But there was another reason too. They worked together. So the United States said to the Soviet Union, and they said to Britain, we're going to fight Europe first, and then they said back to themselves, but we really don't have to fight Europe first because we're so big we can fight both at the same time. We'll tell Churchill everybody goes to Europe, but what we'll really do is send all the Marines, 6, 7 divisions of Marines, and we'll send them all to the Pacific. We'll send all of the carriers, without very few, most of the battleships, and we'll let the Canadians and the British outsource naval power to the extent where it's needed in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. And Army divisions and B-17 strategic bombers will go to Europe. And West Coast ports will supply most of the things Pacific, East Coast. So it was almost as if we had two nations, each of them bigger than Japan and Germany combined. And we supplied the Soviet Union. We said to the Soviet Union, what do you need? And they said, we want to work on artillery, tanks, shells, but we need certain things. We need rubber boots, we need food, we need aluminum, we need radios. And we need especially 6-ton, 3-axle trucks. We supplied 475,000 Chrysler and GM trucks to the Soviet Union. They were so frequent that Goering, after the war, said, we got so sick of those Russian robots on American trucks. We would see them in one place, and by evening, they were 50 miles inside our land. They were the most mechanized, most primitive army in the world. When the war started, in some sense, by 1945, it was the most mechanized. And we meshed very well together. Same thing with Britain. And we had a strategy to go into Normandy. Churchill wanted to go into the soft underbelly up through the Ljubljana Gap, into the Aegean, but we settled on a Anglo-American strategy of try it out in North Africa, see if Italy will work, invade Normandy, let the British be in the north so they can go straight 500 miles into the Ruhr, let the Americans with more power, more manpower take the longer route into Germany, and the entire time coordinate with the Soviet Union so their offensives coincide with ours, and we did it pretty well. And tell the Soviet Union, and we did, you don't have to do anything other than kill Germans. We want you to fight an infantry battle. We'll supply a lot of the trucks. You concentrate on fighters. You concentrate on tanks. You concentrate on artillery. We'll supply everything else. We will fight the Italians. You don't have to fight the Italians. We will bomb the Germans. You don't have to build a 4-engine bomber. You don't have to fight the Japanese. Don't worry about it. You don't have to build one battleship. You don't have to build one aircraft carrier. You can build some submarines, but just kill Germans. And that's what they did. They killed, as I said, 3 out of 4 of every German soldier, but they were not responsible for providing aid to anybody. They did not have strategic bombing. They did not have a submarine campaign. They did not have a surface vessel campaign. They did not have aircraft carriers. They only fought the Japanese for 2 weeks in the war. And so it was this integration and outsourcing of particular responsibilities that were very effective. And you would think that this would be impossible because you were dealing with British colonial monarchy in some sense, parliamentary British democracy, and then you were dealing with radical American democracy and you're dealing with Soviet communism. And then the opposite side was Nazi fascist militarists. They had the same idea about the way society could be organized, and they never coordinated. Germany stabbed Japan in the back when they signed a non-aggression pact. Japan stabbed Germany when they did the same a few months later. Why didn't they just coordinate and attack the Soviet Union at the same time from both coasts? When Hitler declared war on Pearl Harbor, his OKW said, "Where is Pearl Harbor? The Fuhrer has declared war in a place he doesn't even know where it is on the map." And the Italians said on June 22nd, "You didn't tell us you were going to invade the Soviet Union. We don't really want to go." And Hitler said, "We need 180,000, 100,000 Italians got killed on the Eastern Front. We need 180,000 right now." And they said, "But we need them in North Africa." And then the Germans said, "Well, you guys invaded Albania and Greece and got us in a quagmire right before we were going to invade Russia, and you never told us you were going to do that." So you can see that the fascist mind doesn't trust anybody, including other fascists. And that was a great disadvantage. So the war ended when the Allies, from the very beginning of this weird alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States, to a lesser extent China, India, every country but 16 in the world fought this war, and the vast majority joined the Allied cause. It ended because they had a plan how to get to Tokyo or destroy it, and how to get to Rome or destroy it, and how to get to Berlin or destroy it. And the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese had no idea how to get to London and destroy it. They tried, they did not have the resources, they did not have the transport craft to invade Germany. They could not get to the United States, they could not take Moscow, Leningrad, or get to Soviet industry. And that was pretty much why the Allies won and the Axis lost. I'd like to finish by just very quickly reviewing the fates of the 6 countries. Let's start with the Japanese. Everybody thinks Japan did pretty poorly because they lost 75% of their urban area, but they lost 1 million fewer than Germany did, about 3 million, 2.8. And as I said, they killed over about 25 million people. Mostly, the vast majority were Asians. About 500,000 Americans, British, and Commonwealth troops died, but the vast majority were Pacific Islanders, Indonesians, Southeast Asians, and Chinese that were out of uniform and butchered by the Japanese. One thing to remember, and this is very important, all of you were brought up in this mythology that we dropped the bomb and it was very amoral. The United States invasion, we all say, well, it saved the invasion of Japan. And it might have done that, but I don't think that's quite the way we should look at it. The way we should look at it is Curtis LeMay had 2,400 B-29s that from March 11th until August 11th had burned down 75% of the cities of Japan. And it was 1,600 miles one way, 1,600 miles back. My father flew 40 of those missions, and he said it took him 2 years to get off the benzodrine that they gave all the crews to stay awake. 16 hours in the mission. But even under those conditions, they were very successful. After Okinawa was declared secure on July 2nd of 1945, the distance from Okinawa to the mainland was not 1,600 miles, it was about 375 miles. Curtis LeMay, you may say he was the inspiration for Dr. Strangelove, the George C. Scott character, but he had an animal cunning. He said, I've got 2,000 more B-29s on order, and there is 10,000 B-17s and B-24s, and they haven't been doing a damn thing since May, sitting over there in England, and the British want to get in on the kill. They've got 5,000 Lancasters that have a heavier bomb capacity than any American plane. Let's put 10 to 15,000 4-engine bombers on Okinawa, and let's have not 3 missions a week from the Marianas, let's have 2 a day. And his only worry was, could Dow Chemical build enough napalm? So he would have burned down the entire country of Japan by December of 1945 and killed probably 2 million Japanese. The atomic bomb was much less lethal than the March 11th napalm attack. That was the most devastating day in the history of warfare. 100 to 150,000 Japanese died on March 11th when 325 B-29s came in very low with napalm. Second thing, one other thing about Japan, Japan, unlike Italy and Germany, never really came to terms with what they had done. They had a revisionist history almost immediately. South Korea, they never admitted culpability for what they did to South Korea. They never admitted a culpability for China, and there were two reasons for that. One was that we didn't trisect that country, and the British did not occupy it as they did a sector in Germany, and the Soviets didn't. That was entirely an American and MacArthur enterprise. And almost immediately, there was a Chinese civil war. Our allies, the people we'd given all this aid to, were fighting, and communism had just taken over. And then there was the Korean War just 5 years after the end of World War II. And it was felt under MacArthur that we needed Japan unity. We had to keep communism out of Japan. We were the only show in town. We could do what we want. And we allowed Japan to keep their emperor and never have a revisionist history that would come to deal with Japanese culpability. And that's true today. If you meet Chinese scholars about World War II, they cannot even finish a sentence without saying, why do you support the criminal World War II government still in power in Japan? Very different with Germany. Germany was, as you remember, it lost 30% of its population. It went from 80 million to 60 million. It lost East Prussia, it lost the Alsace-Lorraine, it lost the Sudetenland. More importantly, Germany got no sympathy for the largest transfer of population in history. 13 million German speakers walked back to present-day Germany from Czechoslovakia, Poland, and what is now the Baltic states. They got no sympathy because they had been responsible for the Holocaust and killing 27 million Russians and another 3 million non-Jewish Poles. And yet 2 million German civilians died in that walk back to Germany. Germany then was divided into 4 sectors. 3 of them would be united on what we call West Germany, and automatically became the tripwire when the Soviet Union thought that, given their superiority in armor and manpower, they could take over all of Western Europe. So almost immediately we had to arm the Germans and integrate them within 5 years into NATO. Germany then lost about 3.8 million people. About 1 million of them were civilians that died through firebombing, mostly of places like Cologne or Hamburg or Dresden, or starved to death, or were killed in the transfers back. Italy got off the easiest. Well, I shouldn't say easiest. They lost 500,000 soldiers, but they were out of the war by 1943 because they came up with a slick trick that if you were an Axis power and you were going to lose, and you flip sides and say that you never voted for Mussolini and you got rid of him, which they did in July of 1943 with this puppet government, then we felt, well, who were we fighting when we got into Italy? We were fighting Germans, but Germans were fighting Italians, and Italians were fighting us, but Italians were helping us. British were fighting Italians, Germans were fighting British. It was a mess. Italy never was resolved. We never got into Austria as we thought. And the idea was that there was a large Italian-American population. There was a large Catholic population. The Pope had come out and condemned very belatedly the Germans. So their idea was, well, Italy was the only battleground. We only fought in Germany for 3 months. We never fought on the ground in Japan. We fought for 2.5 years in Italy. Give them a break. So we kept the Soviets out. We did not trisect the country. We did not make them surrender very much territory in the north, and they were our allies almost immediately, and we felt they had not been responsible for war crimes. They were delusional and incompetent rather than vicious and anti-American. I'll finish with the 3 allies. As I said, the Soviet Union came out the worst and the best. It lost, as I said, the most of any nation, 27 million. It was a great tragedy because in 1939, Stalinism and the Great Terror had more or less failed. When the German Army Group South entered Kiev, people greeted them. The Ukrainians were ready to revolt had they been treated with just a smidgen of goodwill, they probably would have formed, as it was, 1 million Russians joined the German army. But more would have, because the Soviet Union was just about on the point of collapse. The war gave it great credibility. It was forgotten, as I said, that it had made a deal with all the other belligerents on both sides. And most importantly, they were in the best geostrategic position they'd ever been in, because the traditional bulwark of Western Europe against the Soviet Union, that is Poland, the Czech Republic, what we call the Czech, Romania, Bulgaria. Now these were all Soviet satellites, and the Soviets had a buffer, but also a border right on Germany. So they had advanced communism about 250 miles westward. And they were completely armed, and most importantly, they had a great propaganda. So almost immediately in 1945, we were stuck with the terrible propaganda of having to reform the Italian fascists, the German Nazis, and the Japanese militarists. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union says, we're still fighting World War II. We've saved China, now they're on our side as communists. We're going into Thailand, Laos, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, and we still have the spirits that the United States used to have. But now they've joined the fascists, and they're part of the German, Italian, Japanese war machine. And for people who were peasants in Asia, that sounded pretty persuasive. Koreans, Vietnamese, and we were burdened with that propaganda for the next 30 years. So the United States, in some ways, I think even though we came in late, we were the last of the major powers to get in. We did not help the Soviet Union when it was attacked militarily. We did not help Britain when it was attacked militarily. We only went in when we were attacked, and yet we were the only country to fight a two-front war in every theater. And when we left the war, we suffered the fewest casualties per capita of any country in the war. About 425, as I said, out of 155, 160 million, 140 if you count if you count the army itself, 12 million. So we were the most economical in manpower, and that was largely because we had invested 40% of our military budget in naval and air power. Most countries had invested about 70% in the army. We were very careful not to turn the American army loose against the Wehrmacht. And when we did in Italy and we did in France, we paid a terrible price. Even as Germany was falling apart, even when Germany was being bombed 24/7, the German army killed in Europe between June of 1944 and May of 1945 1.7 American soldiers for every German that was killed, including German soldiers that were bombed. So you can imagine what we were up against. It was the greatest army that was ever produced in terms of fighting power, not logistics or support. Finally, I want to finish with a kind of an iconoclastic that Bob mentioned about Britain. We have this view that Britain was weak, but Britain's army and navy and Royal Air Force and its empire played, in some ways, the most inspirational and pivotal war of the war. Britain was the only country of everybody in World War II that went to war on the principle of saving another country, Poland. We went to war when we were attacked. Germany attacked. Italy attacked. Japan attacked. Soviet Union only went to war when it was attacked. Britain went to war to save Poland. Britain was the only country that fought on the first day of the war, September 1st, 1939, and the last day of the war, September 2nd, 1945. Only country that did that. Britain was the only of the Allied powers that fought the Soviet Union by itself. From the fall of France in June 23rd of 1940 to the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 22nd. A whole year there was only Britain. And Britain, and I'll leave you with this statistic. We think of German manpower today and German industrial might. The British and their empire outproduced the Soviet Union in every category by itself of war material except tanks, and they got very close in tanks. They created more machine guns, more airframes, more small arms fire, more trucks, more fighter planes than did Germany. And as you know, British technology, we sort of make fun of Jaguars and Minis, but very early in the war, the Supermarine Spitfire was either equal or superior to the Me-109. The Germans never produced a bomber like the Lancaster bomber. And they never produced radar sets or sonar. Most of the sophisticated technology that won the naval war, sonar and radar, came from the British, and most of the cryptology and the intelligence breakthrough came from Britain. In some ways, we would not have won the war the way we did without the British and their empire. And with that, I'll open it up. Thank you very much. I don't know, do we have time for questions? I don't know how much time. I talked a little bit too long. Yes?
In analyzing the gross lethality of the war, did you have occasion to look at the role played by ideological triumphalism, ideological racial animosity on all things?
Yes, I mean, the question was, what was the role of ideology and racial ideology? And
also triumphalism.
yes, well, there were two roles played, and we associate usually racial animosity with the Axis powers because they had a formal doctrine of National Socialism. But actually, Japanese Bushido and Shinto Buddhism was almost as racial, as more racial. But in the negative sense, that diluted them to the role of economics and GDP and total manpower. They felt that the Japanese soldier was such and the German soldier was such that they could defeat enemies that relied on air power or relied on transportation but did not have the guts to mix it up. They were quickly disposed of that idiocy when they met the 1st Marine Division in Guadalcanal. All you have to read is William W.B. Sledges with the Old Breed, and you can see the Americans' 1st Marine Division fought hand-to-hand better than the Japanese, who had been fighting for 10 years in China. The second thing about their racial triumphalism is that they lost enormous opportunities in enlisting sympathetic population. So there was a revolt against socialism in Europe. When the German army went into France or Belgium, there were appeasers and there were collaborators, but there were a lot of people who were more afraid of the Soviet Union, given its behavior in the Great Terror, than they were of Germany. And there was a lot of pro-fascist movements, and had Hitler been able to capitalize on that, and even with his racial triumphist ideology, he did enlist over 200,000 non-Germans in the Waffen-SS. One of the things we don't like to talk about is most of the Waffen-SS divisions that committed, 2 or 3 of them that committed the most atrocities in Germany, were made up of Norwegian, Swedish, Dutch, and especially Austrian SS officers. But they lost opportunities. Japan lost opportunities with its Asian allies. It was very strange that for most of the 1920s and 30s, people in Indonesia and the Philippines and Southeast Asia had been told that so-called white Anglo-Saxons, i.e. the British, were the real imperialists, and it only took the Japanese 2 years to make the white Anglo-Saxon imperialists more sympathetic characters to them than fellow Asians. And almost in every case, with minor exceptions in India, Asian populations preferred to be liberated by Americans and British than to cooperate with the Japanese. Yes?
Can you expand a little further on the parallels you drew to pre-World War I, pre-World War II kind of mentality in the United States versus where we've been in the last, say, 20, 25 years here?
Yeah, I think we all, on the campuses, we all object to this industrial military complex or militarism, or why are we spending 4% GDP on the military, $700 billion, but it's a reaction to what we did in 1913, 14, 15, and 16, and what we did from 1935 to 41, with one major exception. We had this brilliant Southern congressman, Carl Vinson, through 3 naval acts. If it wasn't for him, the fleet that defeated Japan in 1945 was already being built in 1941. The Essex carrier and the Iowa and the Missouri class battleships, the future Montana class that was envisioned, B-29, the ideas for the B-29. So all of those military drawings, we were starting to gear up in 41. But as a reaction to that, we said, we're never going to get in that situation again. And that broke down very elementally. So when the Sherman tank, which was a good tank, but it was 30 tons, it had 3.5 inches of armor, it had a short barrel, 75 millimeter cannon, it went up against a Panther and Tiger, and it was blown apart. 88 millimeter or long barrel, 78 millimeter, 5 inches of sloped armor in the case of the Panther. So the Americans said, even though it took 10 hours of maintenance to make a German run 1 hour, and it took 1 hour maintenance to make a Sherman run 10 hours. So we never saw Tigers and Panthers because there was only 2,000 of them, and we had 50,000 Shermans. But when you did see them, it frightens people for the rest of their life. And the Abrams tank project, it took us almost 40 years, but we said we'll never get in a situation where we're inferior as we were in Korea with Russian tanks and World War II, and we're never going to have a fighter that is inferior to the Zero or inferior to the 109. All of ours were until we built the P-47, P-51, and the Corsair and Hellcat. So there was a reaction that we don't want to ever get in that situation again. And more importantly, we felt that Germany and Japan would not have been as bellicose had we been armed. They would have understood. It would have been a reminder how big the United States is and how capable we were. And I think we've been pretty successful with some clear misadventures along the way, but nevertheless, it's worked, yes.
Could you give your comments on how the Depression at the time might have influenced?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The Depression really did influence situation because, as you know, most depressions in American history had lasted about a year to 3 years. The Great Depression that started in 29 had a mini depression in 38 and 39. It went on for a decade. And I think economic historians will believe that a lot of the policies of the New Deal of expanding government, expanding regulations, expanding taxes were the wrong thing, that they suppressed business activity. But whatever your view of that is, Germany and Japan were felt to have gone through depression much easier. And so was Britain. So there was a sense that in the United States, especially with Charles Lindbergh, to take one example, he went over and looked with Goering at the he said, this is the middle of the Depression, and they have this Stuka dive bomber. We have nothing like it. We're way behind the ME-109, and they went through the Depression because they feel something. They're united. We're a motley, and it led to this right-wing sort of self-criticism in the United States. So the Depression did one other thing, and that is it created a level of hardship, rampant poverty in the United States, that it created an ideology that America, I remember my father, I said, well, how could you take Benzedrine all day long and then a sleeping pill, and then when you guys had sinus infections, you had to go up 30,000 feet and your eardrums blew out, and then they told you not even to wear parachutes when you got over to Japan because they were going to execute you and behead you, and he said, compared to the Depression, it wasn't that bad. He said for the first time in his life, he had steak and ice cream. And I think that was true of that entire greatest generation. Yes, in the back.
Why did Britain and France declare war on Germany but not the Soviet Union when both of them invaded Poland?
Well, first, the question was, why did Britain and France in 1939 declare war on Germany but not the Soviet Union? Well, ostensibly, they had no way of getting to the Soviet Union because it was on the other side of Germany, and that was the real reason. But they needed an excuse, and the excuse was that when they went to war in 1939 on September 1st, the Soviet Union did not invade Poland from the backside till 17 days later. And then they did this. Oh my gosh, the Soviet Union invaded. We had no idea they'd do that. But, it's too late to declare war on them now because we're in extremis. But there was it had some effect, and most importantly, if you look at what the appeasing party had been saying, is that they didn't just appease because they were afraid of Germany. They felt that Germany was a check on the Soviet Union, and they used that. And even though they had a non-aggression pact, they thought, well, deep down inside, the Germans will eventually attack them. So why attack them with Germany? Just keep Germany out. And remember, when they declared war on Germany, did they do anything? No. They called it, remember, the phony war, or the Sitzkrieg. The first day of the war, what did Britain do? They put in 20,000 pamphlets, and they bombed Berlin with pamphlets at night saying, please don't go to war with us. And they didn't do anything. France went 8 miles into the Saarland, why the German army was in Poland, and the French general said, well, where's the German army? And the intelligence came back and said, there is no German army. They're all in Poland. You can go all the way to Berlin. And they said, no, we don't want to do it. We'll go back. And hope we don't provoke them. So they sent a letter through diplomatic circles and said, we went into your country, but we didn't mean to, and now we're back. And they had the Maginot Line all the way along the French border up to, unfortunately, the Belgian border. And then they figured that the Germans would never go through a second time as they did in World War I. And of course, the Germans planned to do that all along. Yes. Bob, you cut me off when, yeah. Yeah, no, I'm not you cutting off. Just tell me, he, when I'm out of town.
So,
I don't like listening to myself, so I don't know the effect on you, so go ahead.
well, this is a bit off subject, but
Yeah.
could you please assess where we are militarily at present?
Yeah, the question is, where are we militarily at present? And the good news is that we still spend, even with the armament of China, about 17 times more than all the budgets in the world today, military budgets. And if you look at our fleet, our Air Force, and the quality of our ground troops, I think we're still preeminent. And you look at our technology, we're preeminent. The problem we're having is that after saying that, no other country has so many strategic responsibilities. So we have guaranteed the integrity of Korea, and they're under our nuclear umbrella. I think we have winked and nodded and guaranteed the integrity, I hope, of Taiwan. We have of Japan. We have of all of Europe that can't even spend 2%. We've declared the integrity of Australia, New Zealand, and Israel. And we have alliances de facto with certain Gulf and so-called modern Arab states. The problem with all of this is we don't have a big enough military to fight, say, 2 wars at once to protect all of those strategic interests, not to mention these optional wars like Syria or Libya or Afghanistan or ISIS or the Iraq War. So our strategic ambitions are much greater than our military ability. And what China is doing, I'll just finish on one example. So we have 12 fleet groups. Each fleet group with a carrier is now about 8 to 10 billion. And the fleet that follows it is about 25 billion. We have 12 of them. China's got 1. No other country can take off. They have to take off vertically. We're the only ones that have this technology that's mastered. That being said, there are areas now that we can't operate near the Spratly Islands or the Chinese water, the South China Sea, because they have defensive mechanisms. Same thing off Finland. I'll give you one example. The Chinese have developed technology to send maybe 6,000 to 7,000 missiles, about as long as my arm, about 6 to 8 inches off the water, and they can go about 60 miles. So if a U.S. carrier was in international waters supporting a invasion or an attack on North Korea and China wanted to intervene, they could send a swarm of those right along the coast, and it would take out a $10 billion carrier and 5,000 Americans. We could not stop that. Could China do the same and put a carrier off our coast? No. So their attitude is, we're going to deny the United States the ability to move and be mobile in our sphere of interest. And that's new, but it's not a global threat yet. It will be. We still have a GDP that's twice Japan. I think by most assessments, almost twice China, even though we only have 1/3 the population. But we're getting there. It's not good on the horizon. 2 more questions right there.
2 quick ones.
One quick one.
Did anyone in the German High Command try to talk Hitler out of invading the Soviet Union?
The question was, did anybody try to talk Hitler out of it? It was sort of like the Iraq War. You remember everybody said when the statue fell and 72% of the Wall Street Journal said they were happy with Iraq, and then by Abu Ghraib you only had 22%, and you couldn't find anybody that was ever for the war. Where'd that 50% go? It was sort of, my brilliant war was screwed up by your terrible occupation. And the same thing happened in the Soviet. In the diaries of Halder, in the diaries of Villemont, in some of the transcriptions of Rommel, you see things that say, why are we doing this? But most of the high command thought that they could win because they hadn't been beaten, and the Soviets had such a dismal, and they were very happy up until August. And after the Kiev pocket and the race to Moscow, by December 7th, you know, Japan said they're going to take Moscow. That's one of the reasons they declared war as well. They thought Moscow would fall. But after that little mini Soviet offense, I'd say that half the German people, they had lost 600,000 dead, the Germans had by December, and 50% of the population was negative, and there were major people. Remember, he sacked 32 generals of field marshal staff, 12 field marshals, and the rest were our equivalent of 4-star generals in December 41 till March of 42. After Stalingrad, which fell in February of 1943, there was nobody in the army thought it was a good idea, and if I think most people would say there was no. Goebbels wrote a letter and said there's no public support, so I better change the message. It's not we're going to conquer the Soviet Union that deserved it. We're going to save Western civilization from the raping communist Asiatics horde that's going to come. So whether you like us or not, we're your only choice. And that was a new propaganda because there was no public support for it. Last question.
How strong was American isolationism up to Pearl Harbor? Put another way, what would have happened if Pearl Harbor had not been invaded or some similar?
Yes. Well, remember that the America First group did not really start. I mean, there was isolationism, but it really didn't get going till May of 1940. So it was my point is it was growing, not declining, even though Britain had been bombed, even though there was no more France. And part of the reason was there was a great resentment. There was two reasons for the America First movement. One was there was a great resentment against the Soviet Union because of the Great Terror and the show trials, and they thought that people were quite willing to see the Soviet Union wiped out, and they thought this was good, that these two autocratic juggernauts were going to destroy them. And you'd be surprised, American politicians who said that. Henry Stimson said, let them kill each other off. That was the attitude. Second, we still had a large German population. It was the largest ethnic minority in the United States, not as powerful as World War I. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism who said that these Jewish conspirators, because this was coming from European propaganda, they're trying to get us into another war to save the Jews. And they didn't really believe stories coming out of Germany, or when there were people in the U.S. State Department, let me put it that way, who were openly anti-Semitic and felt that were telling Roosevelt that this was a war for the Jews. And so it was very strong. Had they not attacked Pearl Harbor, I don't think we would have intervened unless Britain may have invaded. If Germany and Italy had not declared war on us after Pearl Harbor, it's clear to me we would have not declared war on Germany or Italy. We would have just fought the Japanese in the Pacific, and then we would have been, and this was clear, people said that. For 3 days, Roosevelt's advisor said, we're going to defeat the Japanese, then we're going to be in a very good position, and Britain will have to come to us, if it's still around, and beg us. But we declared war right back on them. And so had they not declared war on us, I think it would have been pretty bad. And Germany by this time was processing heavy water, and we know now that their nuclear program was about 2 years further developed than we had thought. So I would say that, and Germany was talking about a 3-stage missile to replace the V-2, which was on the drawing boards. The V-1 was 2 years away from deployment. They were talking about, they had a new bomber called the Ural bomber and the American bomber, 6-engine bomber, and they were going to use the Portuguese Azores to bomb what they thought these. So there was some bad things on the horizon. Pearl Harbor, in a very counterintuitive way, shook us up, destroyed the American First movement, kind of discredited Charles Lindbergh, who actually fought quite bravely in the war but was forever discredited, and really saved Western civilization. With that, thank you very much.
Could I just have 30 seconds of your time? My name's Bob Pasner. I'm the director of the Center for Western Civ that sponsored this event. In addition to events like this, one thing we do is that we sponsor every year a visiting scholar in conservative thought. And as many of you know, this year we've had the tremendous pleasure of having Bob Hoffman. And this is just what I wanted to do. It's wonderful this year as a visiting scholar, a tremendous asset to our students and the broader community. So thank you for thanking him, and thank you, Bob.